He saved her life in the dark, in a country that didn't exist on any official map. And 10 years later, she showed up at his front door with lawyers, federal files, and a look in her eyes that said she hadn't forgiven a single second of it. Riker Hayes thought that chapter was buried, classified, gone. He was wrong. She didn't come for an explanation. She came for what she believed he stole. And the terrifying part? He had no idea what she was talking about. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, stay with us. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The boat wasn't going to fix itself, and Riker Hayes had been staring at the cracked fiberglass hull for 20 minutes without actually doing anything about it. It wasn't procrastination exactly. It was more like that thing that happened sometimes on quiet mornings when the coffee was still hot and the marina hadn't filled up yet with noise and people and the low mechanical hum of engines warming up. That window of maybe 15 minutes where the world sat still and let a man think. Or not think, just exist inside the salt smell and the sound of water moving against the dock pilings like it had nowhere urgent to be. Riker crouched beside the hull, running his thumb along the fracture line. 3 inches. Clean. Probably a dock collision, someone who'd had one beer too many coming in after dark. He'd seen it 100 times. He quoted them fair, fixed it right, and they always came back. That was the business model, if you could call it that. No advertising, no website. Just word of mouth spreading slowly through the small boat community the way decent work always traveled, without anyone trying to force it. He was 32 years old, and this was his life. He had decided on a specific afternoon 4 years ago that this was enough. More than enough, actually. The back door of the house opened, and he heard her before he saw her. Dad? Yeah. There's no orange juice. He didn't look up. There's apple juice. I don't want apple juice. I want orange juice. Then I guess you want something we don't have. A pause. The dock boards creaked faintly as she came down the 2 steps from the back porch, and then he heard her footsteps crossing toward him. That particular soft, heavy rhythm of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to walk quietly, who hadn't learned yet that the world didn't need to know you were coming. Ava stopped beside him and looked at the boat the way she always looked at the boats he worked on, like she was deciding whether she approved. What happened to it? Someone hit a dock. That was dumb. Little bit, yeah. She was wearing the blue shirt with the small anchor on the chest. She'd picked it out herself at the second-hand shop on Harbor Street and worn it 3 times in the past week, which meant he needed to either buy a second one or have a conversation about laundry rotation. She had his dark hair and her mother's jaw, and sometimes when she tilted her head a certain way, it landed somewhere between the 2 of them, and Riker had learned not to stare at that for too long. Can I go to Cassidy's after school? You have homework. I can do it there. You say that every time, and every time we get home at 8 o'clock, and you haven't done any of it. She made a face that was not quite a frown, and not quite a pout, but something uniquely hers, a specific expression he had never seen on anyone else, that communicated deep disagreement without quite crossing into argument. She had strong opinions and a tactical instinct for when to press them and when to let things breathe. He figured that came from him. Fine, she said, but we need orange juice. I'll get it. She turned and went back inside, and Riker straightened up from his crouch and let out a breath that was more smile than sigh. His knees had started making a small complaint on cold mornings. He ignored it the way he ignored most physical complaints, registered it, filed it, moved on. He checked his watch. 7:14. He had 45 minutes before the school bus came, which meant time to get the repair quote written up, get Ava fed with whatever she'd accept in lieu of the orange juice she wasn't getting this morning, and maybe start cleaning the primer tools from yesterday's patch job on the Hanover family's Grady White. He picked up his coffee from the overturned crate he used as a makeshift table and took a sip and looked out across the marina. The light was doing that thing it did in September on the Georgia coast, coming in at a low angle across the water and turning everything slightly golden, like the world was gently on fire. A brown pelican sat on a piling 30 yards out, absolutely motionless, in that ancient-looking way pelicans had that made you feel like you were looking at something prehistoric. It was a good morning. It was a straightforwardly good morning, the kind that asked nothing from you except to be present inside it. He went inside. He was making eggs, Scrambled, because that was the only format Ava accepted without protest. When he heard tires on the gravel drive, he didn't think anything of it at first. People pulled into the wrong driveway sometimes, especially with the marina next door. The GPS sent them to odd places. But then he heard more tires. He turned the burner down and moved to the front window without thinking about why he moved to the window instead of the door. Old habit. Old training. You looked before you stepped into a sight line. 3 black SUVs. Not sedans. SUVs. Large recent model. The kind of vehicle that didn't have a single scratch on it because it had never been anywhere that might cause a scratch. They were parked in a loose formation on the gravel in front of his house, and even through the window glass, Riker could see that the engines were still running. The doors opened in sequence. 2 men from the first vehicle, 2 from the third. They moved to positions that were so obviously positions, flanking, perimeter, awareness arcs, that anyone who'd never worn a uniform probably wouldn't notice them at all. But Riker noticed. He noticed the way you notice the weight of something that's been gone a long time and then isn't gone anymore. His hand rested on the window frame. The rear door of the middle SUV opened. She stepped out. He hadn't seen her in 10 years. He'd seen her exactly once in his life, for approximately 11 hours under circumstances that didn't make the paperwork of anyone who'd been in that room, and she had been 20 years old and terrified and bleeding from a cut above her left eyebrow, and he had gotten her out. She didn't look terrified now. She was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt, tailored, the kind of thing that cost more than his monthly mortgage without announcing it. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. He'd last seen it matted with dust and pulled back with whatever had been available. Now it sat at her jaw, precise. She was 30. He did the rough math immediately, an old operational habit, always age the faces, always place them in time. She looked at the house first. Then she looked at him through the window. He didn't step back. She walked toward the front door without hurrying, and behind her the 4 men settled into a loose formation without being asked. They'd done this before. They knew how far back to stand. The knock was 2 sharp raps. Riker crossed the room, checked the angle through the peephole for reasons he couldn't entirely explain to himself since he'd already seen her coming, and opened the door. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "You disappeared after saving my life," she said. Her voice was even, controlled, the way people speak when they've rehearsed something so many times it sounds like they haven't. "But you also took something that belongs to me." He looked at her. He looked at the men behind her. He looked back at her. "You should probably come inside," he said. "I'm making eggs." Damn. She did not want eggs. She made that clear without saying it, the same way she made clear that she found the kitchen table an insufficient setting for what she intended to discuss. She stood near the counter with her arms not quite crossed, more like held, hands loosely gripped at her own forearms, a self-containment rather than a defensive posture. Riker could tell the difference. "You know who I am," she said. "I do now," he said. "I didn't for the first few years." She studied him. "What does that mean?" "It means I know who you were when I pulled you out of a burning building in a country that's not supposed to be on any operational map. I didn't know who Vivian Sterling, the CEO, was until maybe 3 years ago. Read something in a magazine in a waiting room. A magazine. Pediatrician's office." Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite surprise, not quite adjustment, but something recalibrating. She glanced very briefly toward the small shoes by the back door, then back to him. "My company," she said. "Sterling Defense Technologies. You're aware of it." "I've been aware of it for 3 years, yeah." "Then you're aware of what we develop." "Advanced systems architecture, some defense applications. That's as much as any civilian knows." "There was a data module," she said, "during the rescue. An encrypted storage device, roughly the size of a large thumb drive, titanium housing. It contained proprietary system architecture for a project we'd been developing for 4 years. It disappeared that night." Riker turned the burner off. The eggs were done. He wasn't going to eat them now, but there was no reason to burn them. "And you think I took it?" "The rescue team was 3 people," she said. 2 of your team members were killed in the ambush. You were the only one who came out with me. I came out with you and about 60 pounds of tactical gear in the middle of an active firefight. I wasn't stopping to collect souvenirs. I'm not saying you meant to take it. I'm saying it disappeared, and the only explanation that accounts for all the evidence is that it left with you. He turned around and looked at her properly. She held his gaze without flinching. Who died on my team that night? He said. A pause. What? If you've been investigating this for 10 years, you know their names. She blinked. Corman Marcus Webb and Daniel Ortega. Ortega went down in the first 30 seconds, Riker said, not looking away from her. He took a round to the chest plate that should have been fine, but the plate was cracked from a hit 3 weeks earlier that never got replaced because of a supply issue. Marcus got to the east wall and was covering our exit when the secondary explosion hit. I carried you out of that building through about 400 meters of open terrain under sporadic fire. I was not picking things up along the way. The kitchen was quiet. I know that, she said, and for the first time her voice had some friction in it, something that wasn't the controlled executive cadence she'd arrived with. I know what happened. I was there. Then you know I didn't take your module. I know you didn't mean to. What I know is that it's not there, and you're the only thread left. From the hallway, Ava's voice, Dad? The bus is in 8 minutes. Riker looked away from Vivian Sterling for the first time since she'd come inside. He raised his voice toward the hallway. Backpack packed? Yes. Lunch? I think so. You think so or you know so? A pause. I know so. Okay. Come say goodbye. Ava appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had found a hairband somewhere and gotten most of her hair into something that was approaching a ponytail without quite achieving it. She looked at Vivian with the frank, uncomplicated evaluation that 7-year-olds performed on strangers. A full 3-second assessment that took in the blazer, the posture, the hair, and rendered a verdict that Riker couldn't fully read. Hi, Ava said. Hi, Vivian said. Are you here about a boat? A very brief pause. No. Dad fixes boats. I know, I figured. Ava looked at her for another second, then turned to Riker. He bent down and she grabbed the front of his flannel shirt with both hands the way she did. Had been doing since she was 4. A physical hello and goodbye rolled into one gesture, and he put his arms around her briefly, and she let go and picked up her backpack from beside the refrigerator. Orange juice, she said to him as she went out the back door. I know, he said. The door banged shut. He straightened up and looked at Vivian Sterling and found her watching the door where Ava had been. She's yours, Vivian said. Not a question. Yes. Her mother. Not part of the conversation, he said, not unkindly. What is it you actually want from me? She wanted him to come to Sterling Defense Technologies headquarters in Savannah. That was the ask, stripped of the lawyers and the black SUVs and the careful framing. She believed there was information in his operational records, however unofficial and deniable those records might be, that could help her trace the module's disappearance, and she wanted him in the building where her team could conduct a proper forensic interview. Riker said no. She told him she could pursue legal channels. He asked which channels exactly she planned to use for an operation that officially didn't happen, involving a government contract that didn't exist, to recover a prototype that had never been cataloged in any filing that could be submitted to a court. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her recalculating. I can make your life difficult in other ways, she said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was more like she was telling him the truth about something unpleasant, laying out the options honestly the way someone does when they're not quite comfortable with the position they're arguing from. Ms. Sterling, he said, I have a 7-year-old and a boat repair business and a mortgage that I'm ahead on by 1 month. There isn't much available to make difficult. There's her. The air in the kitchen changed. He looked at Vivian Sterling and she looked back at him, and he thought she was probably a decent person who had lived for 10 years with a question that had no answer, and that questions like that, unanswered long enough, will change the architecture of a person in ways they don't always notice. You're not going to threaten my daughter, he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing about training. Under real pressure, the volume came down, not up. The men outside could probably hear a pin drop in the driveway, and they had no idea what was happening in this kitchen. I'm not, she said, and the way she said it sounded genuine, like she'd startled herself with what she'd implied. That was, I didn't mean, okay. I meant that you have something to lose, which means you have a reason to cooperate. Or, he said, it means I have a reason to be very careful about who I put myself near. She exhaled. For a moment, she wasn't the CEO or the woman with the convoy outside. She was 30 years old and she looked tired, and she pressed two fingers briefly to the space between her eyebrows. I've been looking for that module for 10 years, she said. It contains architecture for a defensive electronic countermeasure system that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could be reverse engineered into an offensive weapon. I have had people tell me it was destroyed in the ambush, stolen by the hostile operatives, taken by a third party, lost in the chaos. I've run down every lead. You're the last one. He said nothing. I'm not asking you to confess to something you didn't do, she continued. I'm asking you to help me understand what happened, that's all. He thought about Marcus Webb, who had 2 daughters in North Carolina, and about the cracked plate that was Ortega's bad luck, and about the 40 minutes of open terrain that he could still walk through in exact detail if he needed to, every rock and hollow, and the way the building burned in the rear view of his mind when he finally reached the extraction point. I can come for one day, he said. I need someone to cover Ava's pickup at 3:15, which means I need to make a call first, and I'll need to be back by 6 because she doesn't sleep well when dinner is late. Vivian blinked. You'll come. For one day, to talk. Not to be questioned, not to submit to anything official, just to talk. That's all I need. And the men outside stay outside. She nodded. Okay, he said. He picked up his phone from the counter. Give me 10 minutes. He called his neighbor May, who was 64 years old, retired from the post office, and had opinions about everything, and a fondness for Ava that was mutual. May said yes without asking why, which was one of the better qualities of a good neighbor, the ability to sense when the why was complicated and let it ride. He also called Jimmy Chen, who ran the marina office, and watched the shop when Riker had to be away. Jimmy asked even fewer questions than May, mostly because Jimmy had spent his 20s doing things in the Army that had taught him the same general principle Riker operated on. Some information was need to know, and the default was to assume you didn't need to. He changed his shirt, which he did for no particular reason, or at least no reason he was willing to fully examine. He told May the situation required minimal creativity to explain. A business meeting out of town, back by 6. May asked, was the business meeting wearing a blazer in his kitchen with a car full of men outside, and Riker said essentially yes, and May said she'd be over by 2:30. He wrote a note and stuck it on the refrigerator for Ava in case anything ran long. Had to go to a meeting. May's coming. There's apple juice. Sorry about the orange. Dad. Then he walked out the front door and Vivian Sterling's team parted to let him through, and he got into the back of the middle SUV and sat down and didn't say anything. And after a moment, Vivian got in beside him, and the convoy pulled out. The marina disappeared behind them. He'd been in Savannah before, obviously. It was 40 minutes from where he lived. It was where he bought hardware and took Ava to the Children's Museum, and where he'd had the single worst haircut of his adult life at a barber on Abercorn Street. But the part of Savannah they were driving to now wasn't the Savannah of Spanish moss and riverfront and tourists eating oysters. It was the edge of the city, where the zoning shifted and the buildings got larger and more anonymous, and the streets had fewer trees. Sterling Defense Technologies occupied a low, wide building that looked from the outside like it was trying not to be noticed, which was almost certainly intentional. There was no prominent signage. The parking lot was deep, and the building sat back from the road behind a security checkpoint that asked for nothing dramatic. Just credentials, just a gate, just the slow slide of a barrier that rose to let them through. Inside it was different, not ostentatious but precise. The kind of space designed to communicate seriousness without having to say it, clean lines, efficient lighting, the kind of flooring that absorbed sound so every conversation stayed private. There were people moving through the corridors in small groups, focused, not chatting the way office workers in normal companies chatted. Vivian walked him through it without doing the tour. She wasn't trying to impress him, and he appreciated that. She took him to a conference room on the 3rd floor. There was a man already waiting, 50s, silver hair, the kind of face that was good at not showing what it was calculating. He stood when they came in. Damien Cross, Vivian said. My executive partner and head of operations. Damien Cross extended his hand and Riker shook it. Thank you for coming, Damien said. We know this is unusual. Little bit, Riker said. Vivian has told me about you, what you did that night. He paused. We lost good people. Yeah, Riker said. We did. He sat down across the table, and Vivian sat at the head and Damien Cross sat to her right. And for the next 2 hours they talked about the night in question, the logistics, the timeline, what Riker remembered carrying, what he'd been wearing, what his kit had included, how the evacuation route had been structured. Riker answered everything honestly. He had nothing to hide, and the more completely he answered, the more clearly the timeline assembled itself into something that had no room for a detour through a burning building to collect a data module. Damien Cross took notes. Vivian asked the cleaner questions. Riker got the sense that this had been going on a long time. Not this conversation, but the larger investigation. He got the sense that both of them were tired, but tired differently. Vivian was tired from searching. Damien Cross was tired from something Riker couldn't quite identify yet. At one point, while Vivian was looking at a document, Riker glanced at Damien Cross and found the man watching him with an expression that was gone the instant Riker noticed it. Flat, measuring. The kind of look that didn't belong on the face of someone with nothing to hide. It lasted half a second. Riker filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things that weren't evidence but weren't nothing either. What? The alarm was Vivian's phone. She looked at it, and Riker saw the color shift in her face before she said anything. We have a situation, she said, already standing. Damien, I know. He was already on his own phone. They moved, and Riker moved with them. Not because anyone told him to, but because in his experience, when two people in a building looked like that simultaneously, it was a poor time to sit still. What he found, following them to the building's tech operations center on the second floor, was controlled chaos. There were 12 people at workstations in a long room, and approximately 8 of them were doing something urgent and wrong. Urgent in the way they were moving, wrong in the way they were talking to each other, the way their screens were showing cascading alerts in red. Started 20 minutes ago, a young woman with her hair pulled back, the tech lead, Riker guessed, was telling Vivian before Vivian fully crossed the threshold. We've got an active intrusion in the secondary architecture. They're not in the core yet, but they're moving. We've locked down access points 1 through 14, but they're finding lateral paths. From where? We don't know. We cannot find the origin point. Riker stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the screens. He was not a systems architect. He was not a cybersecurity professional. But the Navy had put him through intensive electronic warfare training in the later years of his service, and there were patterns in what he was seeing on those screens that were not unfamiliar. He'd been through something similar in a very different context. Not a company network, but a communications infrastructure under coordinated jamming attack. And the geometry of how those systems collapsed under pressure had a specific shape that he'd never completely forgotten. That server, he said, pointing to a schematic on the main display. Third cluster from the left on the sublevel diagram. Is that your connection bridge to the external monitoring network? The tech lead looked at him. Who is this? He's with me, Vivian said. Answer him. Yes, the tech lead said, still watching Riker with an expression divided between suspicion and desperation, the second winning. That's the external bridge. Why? Because they're using it as a pass-through, he said, moving closer to the display. They're not attacking the core directly. They're routing laterally through your external monitoring pathways. You've probably given them lower security clearance because you don't consider monitoring access a vulnerability. They're going to reach your data architecture in... He glanced at the progression of alerts on the screen. Maybe 20 minutes if this keeps up. Silence in the room. Isolate the bridge, he said. Take it fully offline. You'll lose external monitoring capability, but you'll cut their route. Vivian looked at her tech lead. Mara. Mara was already at her station. If he's wrong... I'm not asking you to bet on him being wrong, Vivian said. I'm asking you to evaluate what he just said. Mara looked at the screen for 4 seconds. He's right about the routing pattern. She looked at Riker. You're right about the routing pattern. Okay, Vivian said. Isolating bridge, Mara said. For the next 6 minutes, the room was almost silent except for keyboard noise and the soft percussion of alert tones. Then the tones began to slow. Then they stopped. Mara exhaled audibly. We held. Core architecture is clean. The room let its collective breath out in a way that was audible even though no one made a sound. Vivian Sterling stood in the middle of her operations center and looked at Riker Hayes, the boat mechanic from the coastal marina outside Savannah, who had just prevented what her tech lead was already calling, in a voice that still had adrenaline in it, a potential catastrophic breach. That was... Vivian started. Training, he said, because that was what it was. Old training. Your team would have found it. Probably not in time, Mara said from her workstation. She didn't say it gratefully, exactly. She said it the way someone with a scientific mind says something true even when it's uncomfortable. Vivian looked at Riker for a long moment. He could see something changing in the architecture of her assessment of him. The way the fixed idea she'd arrived with was running up against the actual evidence of the person in front of her, and the fixed idea was not winning. I think, she said carefully, we need to keep talking. He thought about Ava. He thought about May's 2:30 arrival and the apple juice on the counter and the note on the refrigerator. I can give you another hour, he said. Then I have to go home. He made it back by 5:47. Ava was doing homework at the kitchen table and May was making something on the stove that smelled like she'd brought her own groceries, which was very May. And when Riker came through the back door, Ava looked up and studied his face with the specific attentiveness of a child who had learned, early and privately, that faces carried information that words sometimes didn't. You okay? She asked. Yeah, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. You do the reading worksheet? Almost. Okay. May handed him a mug of something hot without being asked and patted his arm and said nothing, which was also very May. And Riker stood at the counter and held the mug and felt the strangeness of the day settling into his bones alongside the ordinary warmth of the kitchen, the scratch of pencil on paper, the smell of whatever was on the stove. 10 years. He'd thought it was over. He'd thought the chapter was sealed and filed under things that had happened and would not happen again. He'd thought the weight of that night had been carried long enough that it had turned into something like scar tissue, present, permanent, but no longer raw. He'd been wrong about that. But sitting in his kitchen with Ava 3 feet away chewing on the eraser of her pencil while she thought about a sentence, wrong felt survivable. He'd survived worse. He went back the next morning. He hadn't committed to that when he'd left the night before. He'd said one day, one conversation, and he'd meant it when he said it. But he lay awake until close to midnight turning over the thing he'd seen in Damian Cross's face, that flat half-second of assessment that didn't belong. And by the time he got up at 5:30 to start coffee, he'd already decided that leaving it alone wasn't something he was built for. He dropped Ava at school himself instead of waiting for the bus. She didn't ask why, just accepted the ride with the uncomplicated pragmatism of a child who understood that sometimes adults had reasons they weren't explaining yet. He bought orange juice on the way back. He called Vivian Sterling's number. She'd given him a card before he left, plain white stock, just her name and a mobile number, no title. And she picked up on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping casually either. I want to come back, he said. Not for the investigation. I want to look at your network architecture. A pause. Why? Because whoever hit you yesterday came back for something specific, and I don't think they got it. I think they'll try again through a different route, and if your team hasn't identified the full scope of the intrusion, they're going to be looking at the wrong wall when it happens. Another pause, longer this time. How soon can you be here? She said. Todd. He was there by 8:40. Mara, the tech lead, met him at the security desk with the kind of expression that was not quite hostile and not quite welcoming, something cautiously professional, the face of someone who was good enough at her job to know when she needed help and not quite comfortable enough to admit it easily. She was maybe 28, with the particular energy of someone who'd been awake most of the night running diagnostics and had found things she didn't fully understand yet. I pulled the full intrusion log, she said, walking him through the corridors without small talk. You were right about the bridge being the entry point. What I can't figure out is how they knew to look there. That architecture is proprietary. It's not documented anywhere externally. Someone gave them a map, Riker said. She looked at him sideways. That's a significant accusation. It's not an accusation yet. It's the only thing that makes technical sense. He kept his voice flat, informational. You can find a vulnerability by probing a system long enough, but the way they moved yesterday wasn't probing. They went straight to it. That's not accident. She was quiet for a few steps. I thought the same thing at 3 a.m, she said. I didn't want to say it. I know. They reached the operations center and Mara pulled up the full log on the main display. 27 minutes of intrusion data, time-stamped and route mapped across the network diagram. Riker stood in front of it with coffee he'd been handed by someone whose name he didn't catch, and looked at the pattern of it, the shape of how the attack had moved. He'd been in enough situations where the enemy knew more than they should have. He recognized the texture of it. What's the access record on the external bridge over the last 60 days, he asked. Mara pulled it up. Standard maintenance access, 3 separate instances, all credentialed and logged. Who credentialed these? She zoomed in on the access IDs. The room was quiet for a moment. Those are executive-level credentials, Mara said carefully. Her voice had gone very precise, the way people's voices go when they're stepping onto uncertain ground. Riker looked at the log. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the credentials attached to the last access instance 6 weeks ago, 3 days before the intrusion attempt. He memorized the credential ID. That was another old habit. He committed numbers to memory without deciding to, the same way he calibrated distances without thinking. Can you cross-reference that credential to a specific user? He asked. Technically, yes, Mara said, but that would require going through Mr. Cross, Riker finished. She stopped. He's head of operations, she said. Yeah, Riker said. I know. Boss. He found Vivian in her office on the 4th floor, which was a corner room with 2 glass walls that looked out over the parking lot and the building's interior atrium simultaneously. It was a room designed for visibility, for being seen working. She was at her desk with 4 documents open and a phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear, and she held up one finger when Riker knocked on the open door, finished the call in under a minute, and set the phone down. You found something, she said. It wasn't a question. He closed the door behind him. Maybe, he said. I need you to tell me something first, and I need you to tell me what you actually know, not what you're comfortable saying. She leaned back slightly in her chair. Okay. Damian Cross. How long has he been with you? Something in her face shifted. Not alarm exactly, but the specific alertness of someone who hears their own private concern reflected back at them from an unexpected direction. 8 years, she said. He came on as COO 2 years after I founded the company. He's been my operational partner since then. What was his background before you hired him? Defense contracting, government-adjacent work. He came with strong clearances and referrals from people I trusted. Did you verify the referrals independently? She was quiet for a moment. I verified them through channels he partially facilitated. She said it in a way that made clear she was hearing, as she said it, exactly how that sounded. He had access to the same people I was trying to verify him against. I was 24 and starting a company in a field I barely had traction in yet. I needed someone who knew the terrain. I'm not criticizing you, Riker said. I know, but you're building to something. The credential log on your external bridge network shows executive-level access 6 weeks ago, 3 days before the intrusion attempt. He watched her face carefully. The credential ID traces back to a specific user. Mara couldn't formally confirm it without going through your operations chain, but she recognized the prefix structure. Vivian was very still. You think it was Damian, she said. I think someone with deep inside knowledge mapped your vulnerability and gave that map to the people who attacked you yesterday. The credential access is a starting point, not a conclusion, but the timeline fits. She didn't speak for a long moment. Through the glass wall behind her, Riker could see people moving through the atrium below, ordinary company motion, coffee, and clipboards and focused conversations. The building had no idea what was being said in this corner room. He's been with me for 8 years, she said again, quieter. I know. He was in the room when we discussed the security architecture upgrade last quarter. He would have known every parameter of the external bridge configuration. She stopped. He was also the one who recommended against upgrading the monitoring network's security tier, because he said the cost-benefit analysis didn't support it. Riker said nothing. He let her follow the thread herself. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. If I'm wrong about this, then you're wrong and you've lost nothing except a conversation. But if you're right and you don't look at it, you'll lose the company. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her turning it over, stress testing it the way a careful person tests a structure before putting weight on it. I need more than a credential timestamp, she said finally. Yes, he said. You do. Getting more without alerting Damian Cross was the difficult part. Vivian had a small internal audit team, 3 people who reported directly to her, bypassing the operational chain. She'd created that structure early. She told Riker over a working lunch of sandwiches that someone brought to her office and that neither of them particularly ate, because she'd read enough corporate postmortems to know that fraud and leakage almost always traveled up operational chains, not across them. She called the audit lead, a quiet, meticulous man named Philip Garrett, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the organized calm of someone who had seen bad numbers before and knew how to handle them. And she told him what she needed without explaining the full context. Pull the complete access history on the external monitoring bridge. Cross-reference against executive credentials for the last 12 months. Flag any access that preceded a network security event. Philip looked at Riker once during this conversation, assessed him in the way Mara had, but with less visible discomfort, and said he'd have preliminary findings by end of day. He won't ask questions, Vivian said after Philip left. I figured. He never asks questions. He just pulls the numbers and shows you what's there. That's a good quality in an auditor. She pushed the sandwich wrapper aside. What made you look at the access logs? Most people would have stopped at the network intrusion itself. He thought about how to explain it in a way that wasn't about operational instinct she probably didn't share. The attack was too clean, he said, too confident in its first move. In a firefight, which this is, just a different kind, you don't charge a position that confidently unless you've already scouted it. And if you've scouted it, you got the intel from somewhere. She was watching him with something he couldn't quite name. Not admiration exactly. More like the expression of someone recalibrating a calculation they'd been running on wrong inputs for a long time. You're not just a boat mechanic, she said. I fix boats, he said. That part is completely accurate. You know what I mean? He did. I was good at a specific set of things in a specific environment for a specific period of time. Some of it stuck. Mostly, I'm just better at reading rooms than most people because I had to be for a while in places where reading the room wrong got people killed. She was quiet. I still blamed you, she said. Not apologetically. More like she was naming something plainly, putting it on the table. Even sitting here, even after yesterday, some part of me was still holding on to it. Because it's easier to have an answer, even a wrong one, than to have nothing. She looked at him. Yes. I'd have probably done the same thing, he said. She shook her head slightly, and he thought she was going to argue with him, and then she didn't. She just picked up her coffee, which had been cold for an hour, took a sip anyway, made a face, and set it back down. Tell me about the operation, she said. The actual operation. Not the official version. There is no official version. What you remember. Mom. He hadn't talked about it. Not to anyone. There had been a debrief of sorts, an unofficial one with a handler whose name he'd never known, some windowless room in a building outside D.C., 2 hours of recorded questions, and then a very clear and very quiet instruction that the events of that mission did not exist and would not be discussed. He'd gone home. He'd gotten out of the Navy 14 months later for reasons that had accumulated over time, and that night was only one piece of. He'd moved south, started the business, had a few years of rebuilding, and then Ava had come into his life through circumstances that were their own complicated story, and everything that came before had gradually taken on the quality of something that had happened to a different version of him. But sitting in Vivian Sterling's office, with the September light coming through the glass at an angle that made the whole room look like something remembered rather than something present, he told her. He told her the mission briefing had been sparse. In, find the target, extract, out. The target was a private citizen with knowledge of a pending technology transfer to a hostile foreign buyer. The ambush had been waiting for them, which meant the mission had been compromised before it started, and Marcus had said something about that on the way in. Somebody talked, Sarge, in that flat, certain way Marcus had of stating bad news. And Riker had told him to stay focused. He told her about the building, which was a 3-story structure in a residential area that was not supposed to be a residential area, but had been rebranded as such to provide cover for the operation he was there to disrupt. He'd gone in through the east entry with Marcus on the west, and Ortega hanging back as extraction cover, and he'd found her on the 2nd floor in a room that had been locked from the outside. "I remember the room," Vivian said quietly. "I figured." He kept going. "You were conscious, but not fully. You'd been there a couple of days. I got you moving, we got down to the east entry, and that's when it went wrong. Ortega's plate, the ambush hitting from 2 vectors instead of 1. Marcus went down covering the west egress." "I heard the shot," she said. "Yeah." He stopped for a moment. "I had you, and we had one viable route out, and I ran it. 40 minutes, give or take. I was carrying you for most of it because you couldn't maintain pace in the terrain. When we reached extraction, I handed you to the med personnel, and they took over, and I just sat on the ground." He paused. "I was pretty wrecked." "I know," she said. "I watched you. You didn't know I was watching because you thought I was out. I saw you sit down and put your hands on your knees and just stay there." He didn't say anything to that. "I didn't know your name," she continued. "For years I didn't know your name. The handler wouldn't tell me. I had a physical description and the memory of a man who carried me for 40 minutes through hostile terrain without putting me down and nothing else. How did you find me?" "Facial recognition software," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. "My company developed surveillance technology, among other things. I had a sketch artist rendering from my own memory. I ran it against veteran records 8 years ago and came up with nothing. I ran it again 4 years ago with better software. I got 3 candidates. I investigated all 3. You were the only one who matched enough data points." "The magazine in the waiting room," he said. "What?" "I told you I recognized you from a magazine. It was a business profile. It had your photo." She looked at him. "You knew who I was 3 years ago, and you didn't come find me. What would I have said?" She opened her mouth and closed it. "There was nothing to say," he said. "I did the job. Marcus and Ortega didn't make it home, and I'm never going to have a clean feeling about that. But the job got done. You were safe. That was the point. The data module, I still don't know anything about a data module." "I know that," she said. "I know that now." She said it like it cost her something to admit, not because she was proud, but because she'd been carrying the other version of it for so long that setting it down took real effort. "I'm sorry I came to your door the way I did." "I've had worse mornings," he said. She almost laughed. It was the first time something relaxed in her face since he'd met her, and it changed her whole expression. Not younger exactly, but less armored, like a room with the windows opened. "Your daughter," she said. She asked if I was there about a boat. She did. She's confident. She's 7 and has strong opinions about everything, including fruit juice. She'll be running something by the time she's 30. Does she know what you did before the boats? Age-appropriate version. She knows I was in the military. She knows some of it was dangerous. She doesn't know details and won't until she's old enough to hold them without them being heavy. Vivian nodded slowly. That's careful. She lost her mother when she was 3, Riker said. Not to violence, illness. She's already been through something she'll carry for her whole life. I'm not adding weight until she's strong enough to distribute it. Vivian was quiet. Outside, the building went about its business. You're a good father, she said. I'm a work in progress, he said. Most mornings, I just don't want to mess her up. Punk. Philip Garrett came back at 4:17. He came back with a laptop and a printout and the expression of a man who had found something he would have preferred not to find. He set both on Vivian's desk without ceremony and looked at her over his reading glasses. The credential ID that accessed the external bridge 6 weeks ago, he said, belongs to Damian Cross. That access was not logged in the official security report for that day, which means it was either scrubbed from the visible log or entered through a secondary access path that bypasses standard audit trail. The room was quiet. The secondary path, Riker said. Is that something Cross would have known about? Philip looked at him. He helped build it. He's head of operations. Vivian had her hands flat on the desk again. She was not visibly upset. She was doing something with her face that was effortful and internal, containing something that didn't have anywhere to go yet. What else? She said. Philip adjusted his glasses. I ran the cross-reference further back. There are 7 instances over the past 18 months where executive credentials matching Cross's ID accessed network architecture components that should have had no operational reason to be accessed outside of scheduled maintenance windows. 3 of those instances preceded external security incidents, not as severe as yesterday's intrusion, but consistent in pattern. 7 times, Vivian said. Yes. And none of this appeared in standard audit reports. None of it. She looked at Riker. He looked back at her. I need the board to see this, she said, less to him and more to herself the way people think out loud when the scale of something is still landing. Before I confront him, before anything else, I need the board to have this information so that whatever he does when he finds out we know, there are people with standing to act on it. How many board members can you reach tonight? Riker asked. 3 for certain, possibly 4. She was already picking up her phone. She stopped. You don't have to stay for this. I know. Ava, May has her. I'll call. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in that look he didn't try to read. It was too complicated, and the timing was wrong, and there was too much in the room already. Thank you, she said. It came out simpler than he expected. No executive cadence, no boardroom register, just 2 words from someone who meant them. Don't thank me yet, he said. We haven't confirmed anything. She was already dialing. He called May from the hallway outside Vivian's office. May said Ava had finished her homework, eaten 2 helpings of something May called my chicken thing, and Ava was apparently calling it the best dinner ever, which May reported with audible satisfaction, and that Ava wanted to know when he was coming home. Tell her I'll be a few more hours. Tell her I'll come in and check on her when I get back, even if she's asleep. She'll be asleep, May said. She crashed out on the couch watching the Nature Channel 20 minutes ago. Is she covered? I put a blanket on her, Riker. Okay, thank you, May. Is this the woman with the blazer? Yeah. Is everything all right? He looked down the hallway toward the light coming under Vivian's office door and thought about Philip Garrett's printout and the 7 access timestamps and the flat look on Damien Cross's face that had lasted half a second and told him everything he'd needed to know before he'd known what it meant. I think it will be, he said. It's complicated right now. It always is, May said, in the tone of someone who'd seen enough of life to find that fact tedious rather than alarming. Come home when you can. He went back inside. Opa. Damien Cross came looking for him at 6:12. Riker was in the operations center with Mara, who had been pulling additional network logs at Vivian's request, when he felt more than heard the door open behind him. He turned around and Cross was standing in the doorway in his jacket, one hand resting against the frame, his face organized into an expression of casual authority that cost him some effort to maintain. Riker could see the effort, faint and hidden under the surface, the small excess tension around the eyes. Mr. Hayes, Cross said. I didn't realize you were still here. Wrapped up a few things with the network team. Cross looked at Mara, then back at Riker. You've been very helpful, both yesterday and today. His tone was warm and his eyes were not. I imagine you want to get back to your daughter. I'll head out shortly. I can arrange an escort if you'd like. Make sure you get to your car. I know where my car is, Riker said pleasantly. A beat. Of course. Cross smiled, and it was a technically correct smile, the kind that had been practiced past the point of looking practiced. Vivian is lucky to have found someone with your particular knowledge base. It's an unusual background for a civilian contractor. I'm not a contractor, Riker said. I'm just visiting. Right. Cross held the smile for one more second. Well, don't stay too late. He left. Mara waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway. Was that a threat? She asked quietly. Riker looked at the empty doorway. I don't think he's decided yet, he said. And that was the part that mattered. Cross hadn't decided yet, which meant he didn't know how much they knew, which meant he was still calculating rather than acting. That was the window Vivian needed to get to her board. He pulled out his phone and texted her. Cross came to the ops center. He knows something's moving. Get to your board contacts tonight. Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. Already on with 2 of them. Stay close. He looked at that last part. Stay close. He wasn't entirely sure what that meant in the context of a woman who had arrived at his house 24 hours ago, convinced he'd stolen from her company, and who was now asking him to stay close while she dismantled a 10-year deception she'd built her professional life around trusting. He wasn't entirely sure it mattered what it meant. He stayed. He drove home that night with the windows down. It was almost 9 o'clock, and the coastal air had cooled into something that didn't quite qualify as fall but was leaning toward it. That specific September temperature where the heat of summer finally loosens its grip for a few hours after dark. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the radio off, and his mind doing the thing it did when there was too much information to organize consciously, just letting it run underneath, sorting itself. Damian Cross had been in that company for 8 years. 8 years of board meetings and budget reviews and strategic conversations in rooms where the entire architecture of Sterling Defense Technologies was laid open for discussion. 8 years of building trust with a woman who had been 24 years old and needed someone who knew the terrain, who had needed that so badly she'd verified his referrals through channels he'd partially controlled. Riker knew something about the patience that required. Not the patience of a good man, but the patience of a careful one. The kind of patience that was indistinguishable from integrity until the moment it revealed itself as something else. He pulled into his driveway at 9:17. The front light was on. May had left the kitchen lamp burning, which was her version of a welcome home, and through the window he could see the small shape of Ava on the couch exactly as May had described. Sideways, 1 foot hanging off the edge, the blanket pulled up to her chin and then apparently abandoned halfway. He sat in the truck for a minute. He was thinking about the storage unit. Well, he hadn't been to the unit in over a year. It was a climate-controlled space on the east side of town, 10 by 10, rented for $50 a month, and it contained the things from his Navy service that he'd decided to keep without deciding what to do with. A footlocker, 2 duffel bags, a sealed plastic tote with documentation that he'd never formally processed through any system because the operations it documented had never formally existed, and a hard-sided equipment case, black, combination locked, that he'd packed out of his last deployment kit and never opened since. He'd never opened it because he'd told himself there was no reason to. He was now reconsidering whether that was true. He went inside, checked that Ava was still breathing, with the slightly ridiculous vigilance of a parent who knew she was fine and couldn't quite stop checking anyway, adjusted the blanket, and carried her to bed the way he still could, barely. She was getting big enough that it wasn't going to work for much longer, and some nights he was aware of that weight as a thing to hold on to while he still could. He got her settled, stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark. Then he went to the kitchen and called Vivian. She answered in 2 rings again. He was starting to recognize that as a pattern. "I need to check something," he said. "On my end." "What do you mean?" "I have equipment from my last deployment. Personal kit I packed out when I got home. I've never gone through it completely." A silence on the other end. "You think the module could be there?" she said. "I think it's the one place I haven't looked because I didn't know I needed to look anywhere." He paused. "If it's there, Vivian, if it's there, it doesn't mean I took it. It means it ended up in my kit during the chaos of the extraction, and I never knew." "I know that," she said, quiet but firm. "I know that. I'm going to go look tomorrow morning, early, before I drop Ava at school. I'll call you." "I can come with you." "No," he said. "I'll call you." Another pause. He could hear her deciding not to push. "Okay," she said. "How are the board calls going?" "2 confirmed for an emergency session day after tomorrow. I'm working on the 3rd, the 4th. Hartley. He's in London, and the time difference is making it difficult, but his assistant says he'll make himself available." She sounded like she was running on something other than sleep, that specific register of someone who had moved past tired into a kind of wired function. "Philip is still pulling records. He found 2 additional access instances we hadn't flagged. One of them was the week before the first minor intrusion event, 8 months ago. So the timeline goes back further than we thought. 18 months at minimum, based on what we have now. Philip thinks it may go back further, and we just don't have the full log trail yet because some records were overwritten. Overwritten or deleted? She took a breath. He thinks deleted. There's a structural gap in the archive that doesn't match normal data management patterns. It looks like someone who knew exactly how to clean a trail. Riker was quiet for a moment. Damien built your records management system, he said. Yes, she said. He did. The word yes landed like something dropped from a height. Get some sleep if you can, he said. You too, she said, which was the kind of thing people said when they both knew neither of them was going to manage it particularly well. He was at the storage unit by 6:15. The facility was mostly empty at that hour. One other car in the lot, a man loading furniture into a truck 2 rows over, paying no attention to anything but his own mourning. Riker punched in the gate code and walked to his unit and stood in front of the roll-up door for a few seconds before he opened it. The inside smelled like sealed air and old nylon and something metallic and familiar that he didn't have a clean name for, the smell of equipment that had been places. The footlocker sat in the corner, combination locked. The duffel bags were stacked against the left wall. The plastic tote was on the floor with a cracked lid he'd never gotten around to replacing. And the hard-sided equipment case was exactly where he'd left it, on the right side shelf, between a coil of climbing rope he'd never used again and a box of Ava's outgrown clothing he'd meant to donate for 8 months. He stood there. The case was not large, maybe 24 inches long, 14 wide, 8 deep. It had been his emergency kit, the stuff he staged separately from his main loadout for the kind of operations that needed to move fast and light. Comms equipment, a small medical kit, certain tools he'd requisitioned over the years and never returned. He'd locked it when he packed out, stowed it, told himself he'd deal with it eventually. He went to it, worked the combination without having to think. His fingers remembered the numbers before his mind articulated them, and opened the lid. The inside was organized the way he'd organized everything in those years. By function, by likelihood of use, by access sequence. Comms gear on the left, wrapped in padded cloth. Medical supplies in the front right quadrant, still sealed in their original packaging because he'd never needed them on that last operation. Behind the medical kit, a waterproof document sleeve, a multi-tool, a small handheld signal device. And beneath the signal device, wedged into the bottom right corner, under a layer of dense foam padding that had shifted slightly over the years, was something that should not have been there. He almost missed it. Almost. The foam had settled in a way that concealed the bottom corner unless you were actively looking, and he hadn't been actively looking, hadn't looked in this case at all. But the foam was sitting at a slight angle it wouldn't have sat at if there was nothing under it, and his hands noticed that before his mind caught up. He lifted the foam. It was roughly the size of a large thumb drive. Titanium housing, matte gray, with a small recessed port at one end and a serial number etched into the side in characters he recognized as a government contractor format. No identifying labels, no markings that would mean anything to someone who didn't already know what they were looking at. He didn't touch it at first, just looked at it. In the chaos of 40 minutes of open terrain with a half-conscious woman across his shoulders and sporadic fire tracking their movement through the dark, in that specific hell of exhausted function, of the body doing what it had to do while the mind narrowed to a single point of focus, he had apparently, at some moment he had no memory of, secured this device the same way he'd secured everything loose in a hot extraction, without thinking, without categorizing, pure training. He picked it up carefully. It was lighter than he expected. The casing was intact, no damage, no sign of tampering. The recessed port cover was still sealed with what he now recognized as a factory security strip, a thin band of material that, if the port had ever been accessed, would be visibly broken. The strip was intact. He stood in the storage unit for a long time, holding a 10-year-old encrypted data module that had never been opened, that had started a decade of suspicion and a bilateral cyber war that was still actively in progress, and that had been sitting 30 feet from his sleeping daughter in a climate-controlled unit on the east side of a small coastal town in Georgia. He called Vivian. She answered before the first ring had fully completed. "I found it," he said. Silence. It's in my equipment case, he said. Bottom of the kit. It went in during the extraction. I must have pocketed it off the floor of that building without realizing. You were moving in and out of consciousness. The ambush was already hitting. I don't have any memory of picking it up, but I obviously did. Is it? Her voice was carefully controlled. Is it intact? Security strip on the port is unbroken. It's never been accessed. He heard her exhale. It was not a small sound. Don't move it yet, she said. I need to get our forensic specialist there before anything is handled further. The integrity of the seal needs to be independently documented. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I'm Riker. She stopped. Started again. 10 years. Yeah. I accused you of... You did, he said. And now we know you were wrong. That's where we are. It's okay. It's not okay, she said. It's really not. It will be, he said. Make your calls. What? Her forensic specialist arrived at 9:40. His name was Keene, and he came in a nondescript sedan with a hard case of his own, and he did his work with the quiet efficiency of someone who had documented sensitive things in difficult circumstances before and found drama about it unhelpful. He photographed the module in situ before touching it. He documented the security strip with a macro lens. He produced a chain of custody form that Riker signed and dated, and then he bagged the module in a sealed evidence sleeve and noted the time to the second. It's clean, Keene said, looking at the strip one final time through his lens. No access. The housing is consistent with the original manufacturing spec. No physical modifications. Is that something you can certify formally? Riker asked. That's exactly what I'm going to do, Keene said. This will stand up. Riker locked the case back up when Keene left. He stood in the storage unit for another minute with the door still rolled up, looking at the shelf where the case sat, the coil of rope beside it, the box of Ava's outgrown things. Then he locked the unit and drove to Ava's school, because she had a half day for teacher planning, and he needed to pick her up at noon. She talked about a girl named Jordan for almost the entire drive home, and Riker let the words wash over him the way a man stands in a warm current, not listening, but listening in a way that was less about processing information and more about being present inside the normalcy of it, the ordinary, miraculous fact of his daughter in the passenger seat, talking about Jordan's opinion on the fair that was coming to town next month, and whether the ring toss game was rigged, and if so, was it illegal? Probably legal, he said. Technically. That's like almost the same as illegal. It's not, but I see your logic. Jordan's mom said she'd take us. Can I go with Jordan's mom? When? 2 weekends from now. Let me check what we have. We never have anything. That's not true. Name one thing. He thought. I was going to caulk the back porch. She looked at him with an expression of refined contempt that only a 7-year-old could fully achieve. That's not a thing that affects me. It affects the structural integrity of the porch. Dad? Yeah, you can go with Jordan's mom. She turned back to the window, satisfied, and he drove. He thought about the module in Keene's evidence bag. He thought about Vivian, who was somewhere in a Savannah office, making quiet, careful calls to people who had the authority to do what needed to be done, and about Damian Cross, who was also somewhere in that building and had no idea yet how much had already unraveled. He thought about the specific moment in the extraction when he'd crossed the threshold of that building with Vivian across his shoulders. He'd been at the outer edge of his physical capacity. The 40 minutes he'd described to Vivian as a number had been, in lived experience, something closer to the outer edge of what a body could do while still functioning. He'd been operating on training rather than thought. His hands had been doing things he hadn't fully consciously authorized. One of those things, he now understood, had been picking up a titanium device from the floor of a burning building and pocketing it. He would never remember doing it. That was the particular cruelty of the body under that kind of stress. It performed and didn't always file the paperwork. Dad? Ava said. Yeah. Are you in your head again? Little bit. Is it the blazer lady? He glanced at her. What? The lady who was in the kitchen yesterday, with the car full of men. She said it simply, matter of fact, the way she named things. May said she was fancy. May should not be giving you assessments of my visitors. May says a lot of things. Is she coming back? Probably, for work stuff. What work stuff? You fix boats. It's complicated, Ava. She considered this for a moment. Does she know you fix boats because you were wearing your flannel when she was there and not your work clothes? I was not aware you were keeping track of what I was wearing. I notice things, she said, with considerable dignity. He looked at her again and thought about what Vivian had said. She'll be running something by the time she's 30. He was increasingly of the same opinion. She's someone I helped a long time ago, he said, before you. There was a situation, and now there's some follow-up. It's work, but not boat work. She absorbed this. Is it dangerous? No, he said, and believed it, mostly. Okay, she said, and turned back to the window, apparently satisfied with mostly. Thanks. He was at the marina by 1 because Jimmy had a 32-foot Bertram coming in with a fuel system problem that needed diagnosis before the owner arrived at 3. He spent 2 hours with his head inside an engine compartment and found the blockage, which was satisfying in the uncomplicated way that finding blockages was satisfying. It was there, it was the problem, you addressed it, it was done. His phone rang at 2:40. He answered with an oil-stained hand. Yeah. We have a problem. It was Vivian. Her voice had a different quality than the controlled executive register he'd been hearing. Something tighter, compressed. He straightened up. What happened? Damien knows, or suspects, but it amounts to the same thing at this point. He came to my office 20 minutes ago with a report, a formal intelligence assessment, he called it, complete with documentation, mission files, network data. She stopped. He's saying it was you. He's saying that you planted the evidence of his access logs, that your presence in the building was a coordinated operation to frame him, and that the module itself, he knows about the module, Riker, someone told him we'd found it, that the module has been accessed and the data compromised, and that you were the one who accessed it. The marina sounds continued around him. The water, the gulls, a boat engine somewhere down the dock. He's lying, Riker said. I know he's lying. Keene documented the security strip before the bag was opened. I know, but Damien's report is polished, it's thorough. It has citations and cross-references and mission file fragments I cannot immediately verify because those records are classified. He's had this prepared. He didn't put this together in 48 hours. This has been ready. Riker leaned against the side of the Bertram. He was building a contingency, he said. If he was ever exposed, he had a counter-narrative ready. He just needed a specific person to pin it on. And then I brought you here, she said. It came out with a quality he recognized, the specific guilt of someone who has inadvertently put another person in the crosshairs. You didn't know. I pulled you into this. Vivian, he kept his voice even. This was already my problem. It's been my problem for 10 years. I just didn't know it yet. He needed someone, and I was the only candidate. Military background, classified operation, deniable. If you hadn't come to find me, he'd have found a way to use me without my involvement. At least this way I'm in the room. She was quiet. What does the board think? He asked. They haven't seen his report yet. He circulated it internally first to 2 of the board members I haven't reached yet. I found out because Hartley's assistant called me. Hartley saw it and is waiting to hear my response before making any judgments. But the other 2... She stopped. I don't know where they land. Can you get everyone together tomorrow? I'm working on it. Then that's what we do. I need to see his report, tonight if possible. I can send it to you. Send it to me and then don't call. Let me work through it. Riker, I spent 11 hours with you in that building when you were 20 years old and scared and badly dehydrated, and I walked you through 400 meters of hostile terrain in the dark. I remember that operation the way you remember things that have been filed under the category of things that mattered. He paused. I remember every decision I made that night, every position, every time check, every cover point. If you put together a fabricated intelligence report about that operation, I'm going to find every place where it doesn't match what actually happened. A silence. Send me the report, he said. It came through at 4 o'clock. 12 pages. formatted with the professional precision of someone who understood how to make a document look authoritative. Headers, subsections, document reference numbers in the margins that looked real because they were real, pulled from the partially classified framework of the operations administrative record. Riker read it at his kitchen table with coffee and a legal pad. He read it the way he'd been trained to evaluate intelligence, not as a narrative to be followed, but as a structure to be tested. He was looking for the joints. Every fabricated document had joints, places where the manufactured material met the real material, and those joints were almost never perfect, no matter how careful the fabricator was, because fabrication required filling gaps that real events had filled differently. He found the first joint on page 3. The report cited an access log showing Riker's credentials were used to enter a military contractor's digital archive 3 weeks after the original rescue operation. The access was described as the point at which the module's encrypted data was copied and distributed. The problem with this was that Riker hadn't had any digital credentials 3 weeks after the operation. His credentials had been suspended as standard protocol during the debrief window, a 7-week suspension that was routine for personnel coming out of deniable operations. He had documentation of that suspension in the plastic tote in the storage unit because it had been relevant to his pay grade and he'd kept the paperwork. He wrote credential suspension window, documented on the legal pad. He kept reading. Page 6 referenced a specific communications relay point in the operational grid, a GPS coordinate cited as the location of a handoff between Riker and an unnamed foreign contact. The coordinate placed the handoff at a building that, according to the mission grid Riker still carried in his head with the fidelity of something burned in rather than learned, was on the wrong side of the security perimeter. Inside the cordon, not outside it. The handoff would have required Riker to be simultaneously inside and outside a controlled perimeter. He wrote grid coordinate inconsistency, page 6 on the legal pad. Page 9 cited 2 eyewitness statements from unnamed personnel who reported seeing Riker in an area of the extraction site he had not been. The timing cited, 23:14, was a problem because he could account for every minute of 23:14 with a level of specificity that came from the fact that 23:14 was when he'd been carrying Vivian across the most exposed section of the extraction route, when 2 separate small arms engagements had occurred from vectors north and northeast, when he'd made the specific decision to angle east to use a stone wall as temporary cover, and when he'd checked his watch specifically because he was calculating their distance to the extraction point against his remaining physical capacity. He'd been watching the clock at 23:14 because he was afraid he was going to run out of body before he ran out of distance. He wrote 23:14, full account available. Vivian was conscious intermittently and can corroborate position. He went through the entire 12 pages. He found 9 significant inconsistencies, not speculation, not interpretation, but factual discrepancies that could be directly contradicted by documentation, by physical evidence like the security strip on the module, or by first-person testimony from someone who had been present and could corroborate the actual timeline. By the time he finished, it was almost 7. Ava had eaten a bowl of cereal for dinner because he'd been distracted and she'd solved the problem independently, which he noted with a mix of parental guilt and private pride. He called Vivian. 9 inconsistencies, he said when she answered. I can document or corroborate every one of them. 2 through physical evidence, 4 through operational records, 3 through direct testimony. Mine and yours. Silence on the other end for a moment. 3 through testimony, she said slowly, including mine. You were intermittently conscious during the extraction. You can corroborate my position at specific times that Damien's report directly contradicts. Another pause, heavier this time. He counted on me not being asked, she said. He counted on the mission being classified enough that no one would put me in the room as a witness to my own rescue. He planned this 10 years ago, Riker said, and it's a good plan. It would work against someone without my memory and without a witness. He just didn't account for the witness being the person who hired him. He could hear Vivian breathing. When did you know it was him? She said. Not suspect, no. When he came to the operations center that second day, Riker said, the half-second look. Men who have nothing to hide don't assess threat levels when they enter a room. He came in and he clocked everyone's position and tried to cover it, and the cover was 1 beat too slow. He paused. It's a specific look. I've been on both sides of rooms with people who had that look, and you never said anything to me directly. I had suspicion, not evidence. You don't act on suspicion when the target has been trusted for 8 years. You gather until you have something that can stand up. She was quiet for a long moment. He sat across from me in board meetings for 8 years, she said. He remembered how I take my coffee. He asked about my mother when she was sick. He sent flowers to her hospital. There was something in her voice that wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was the specific grief of betrayal that has had time to mature. Something that's been carried so long in a different form that when it finally arrives in its true shape, the recognition is more exhausting than shocking. I'm sorry, Riker said. I feel stupid, she said. Don't, he said. He was very good at it. That's not a reflection on you, it's a reflection on how long he practiced. She exhaled slowly. The board meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. All 4 members confirmed. Good. I want you there. He thought about May, about the school pickup schedule, about the Bertram owner coming back Thursday with a question about the fuel filter replacement. He thought about how quickly the last 3 days had overwritten the ordinary shape of his life. I'll be there, he said. Riker. She stopped. Started. Whatever happens tomorrow, regardless of how the board responds, I want you to know that I'm going to say clearly in that room that I was wrong about you. Not because it's necessary for the investigation, because it's the right thing and I should have said it sooner. He didn't say it was fine. He didn't tell her not to worry about it. Thank you, he said instead, because she meant it and she'd earned the right to mean it. Get some sleep, she said. You too, he said, and this time it felt less like a formality. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after hanging up. The legal pad with its 9-line items sat in front of him. 9 points of failure in a plan that had been constructed to be airtight and had failed because its architect had not accounted for the specific, inconvenient, ineradicable fact of Riker Hayes' memory. He thought about Marcus Webb and about Ortega's cracked plate, and about the 40 minutes that had apparently included a detail he'd never known. He thought about Ava asleep down the hall. He turned the legal pad face down on the table and went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well, but he slept. He was up at 5:15 without an alarm. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, running through the 9 inconsistencies in Damien's report the way you run a hand along a wall in the dark. Not because you expect to find something new, but because the contact is reassuring. He had them clean. He knew where each one lived in the 12 pages, knew the exact language Damien had used, knew the precise counter-evidence that collapsed it. He'd gone over it enough times that it had stopped feeling like preparation and started feeling like something he simply knew, the way you know the layout of your own house. He made coffee. He made Ava's lunch, because on days when he'd been distracted, he tended to overcompensate in the small logistics. And he wrote her a note for when she woke up. May's coming at 7. I'll be back by afternoon. There's banana bread on the counter. Don't eat it all before breakfast. Dad. He put it on the refrigerator under the magnet shaped like a fish that she'd picked out at a gas station 3 years ago and still considered essential. Then he sat with his coffee and his legal pad and did nothing for 20 minutes, which was its own kind of preparation. The drive to Savannah in the early light was quiet. He passed the storage unit on the east side of town and thought about the empty corner where the equipment case sat, the foam pad that had concealed what it concealed for a decade. He thought about how many times he might have gone in there for something else, the climbing rope, the document sleeve, and never noticed the slight angle of the foam, never looked underneath. 10 years in a climate-controlled unit, $50 a month, and the thing that had been tearing a woman's company apart was sitting there, unremarkable and untouched in the bottom corner. He got to Sterling Defense Technologies at 8:40. The parking lot was already filling with cars that hadn't been there at this hour on previous mornings, which told him Vivian had briefed people. The energy of a building that knew something was happening even when most of its occupants didn't know specifically what was detectable in small ways. The slightly faster pace of people crossing the lobby. The cluster of 2 women near the elevator who stopped talking when he walked past. The security desk personnel who checked his credentials with more attention than they'd given him on previous days. Vivian met him on the 4th floor. She looked like someone who had been awake since 4 and had chosen clothes that communicated she hadn't, which took effort, and he recognized the effort. Dark blazer, her hair managed, a level of composure that was load-bearing rather than comfortable. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Stop thanking me," he said, not unkindly. "Where are we?" Board members are in the small conference room. Philip is setting up the documentation display. Keene sent his forensic certification of the module overnight. It's in the packet. She was walking as she talked, leading him down the corridor. "Damien is in his office. He doesn't know the board is here yet." "What time does he normally arrive?" 9:15, 9:30. He never comes in before 9. "So we have time." "Enough!" She pushed open the door to a conference room smaller than the one he'd sat in 3 days ago. Oval table, 6 chairs, natural light from a single east-facing window. 4 people already seated, ranging in age from late 40s to mid-70s, with the collectively careful expressions of people who had read something overnight that they were still organizing their reactions around. Vivian introduced him simply. Riker Hayes, the individual referenced in the investigation. There was a moment where he felt the weight of their assessment, 4 sets of eyes making a determination. And he met it without filling the silence, because he'd been assessed by people in more consequential rooms than this one, and had learned that the instinct to fill silence with reassurance was almost always a mistake. "Mr. Hayes," said the eldest of the 4 board members, a heavy-set man named Forsyth, who Vivian had mentioned chaired the board's audit committee and had been with the company since its 2nd year. "I've been looking at your military record, as much of it as is accessible, which isn't much." "No," Riker said, "it isn't." "The operation in question. Were you ever formally debriefed about the equipment you carried out?" "Informally. 2 hours in a building I couldn't find again. No written record, no official documentation. The operation didn't exist." "And the module?" "Was in my equipment case until 3 days ago. I didn't know it was there. The forensic certification in your packet documents that the security seal was unbroken." Forsyth looked at the packet in front of him. He looked at Riker again. He had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen companies survive crises and fail crises and had developed over time an instinct for which kind of room he was in. "All right," he said. The woman to his left, a compact, sharp-eyed board member named Allison Marsh, who ran 2 other companies and had joined Sterling's board 3 years ago, leaned forward slightly. "You said you identified 9 inconsistencies in Mr. Cross's report." "Yes." "Walk us through them." He did it without the legal pad, because he didn't need it. He took them through each inconsistency in sequence, methodical and unhurried, citing the specific page and language in Damien's report before explaining the contradiction. He kept his voice level. He didn't perform indignation, and he didn't make it personal. He treated it the way he'd been trained to treat a mission debrief, as an account of what happened, with the evidence that supported the account without editorializing. The credential suspension window took 90 seconds to explain, and another 45 for Philip to pull the supporting documentation onto the display screen. The administrative suspension order, time-stamped and signed, covering the exact window Damien's report claimed Riker had used those credentials. The grid coordinate inconsistency took a little longer, because Riker had to explain the operational grid structure before the discrepancy made sense to people who hadn't been in the field. Marsh asked 2 sharp questions that told him she was following precisely. Forsyth took notes. The 2314 timestamp, the one he'd been most careful with, the one he'd known would require corroboration, he handled last. "At 2314, Damien's report places me at an alternate location via 2 unnamed eyewitness statements," Riker said. "At 2314, I was at a specific position on the extraction route that I can describe in exact detail. The reason I know the exact time is that I checked my watch at that moment because I was calculating distance against physical capacity." He paused. "And there's a witness to my position." He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't need to. "Ms. Sterling was intermittently conscious during the extraction," he said. "She was conscious at 2314. I know this because she said something, 2 words. She told me to keep going, which she probably doesn't remember saying. And because when we reached temporary cover at the eastern stone wall, she was aware enough to take her own weight briefly against the wall while I assessed the next segment of the route." He stopped. Marsh turned to Vivian. "Ms. Sterling." Vivian had been sitting at the head of the table with the kind of stillness that was its own form of effort. I remember the wall, she said. I remember the cold of the stone. I remember being told to put my hand against it. She paused. I don't remember saying anything, but I remember the wall, and I remember being told we were close. And your position, Marsh said to Riker. At that point, I was within 4 meters of her at all times from the building to the extraction point, he said. If Damien's report places me at a different location at 2314, the witness is not unnamed. The witness is the person sitting at the head of this table. The room was quiet for a moment. Forsyth set down his pen. He looked at Vivian. You understand what you're being asked to corroborate. I understand, she said. I corroborate it. Spam. The door opened at 9:22. Damien Cross walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of a man who had not been told a board meeting was happening this morning and whose ability to absorb that surprise was being tested in real time. He was good at it. The expression shifted in under 2 seconds from startled to composed, and the composed version was convincing. It had been convincing for 8 years. But he saw Riker, and the composed expression developed a hairline fracture that wasn't quite detectable if you didn't know to look for it. Vivian, he said, I didn't know this was on the calendar. It was a late edition, she said. He looked at the board members. He looked at Philip's documentation display on the wall screen. He looked at the sealed forensic evidence bag containing the module, which sat on a side table in plain sight because Vivian had decided to put it in plain sight, and something moved behind his eyes that was quickly suppressed. I'd like to know what this is about, he said. Please sit down, Damien, Forsyth said. Cross pulled out a chair across from Riker. He sat down. He set his portfolio on the table and put his hands on it and looked at Vivian with the particular expression of a man who is not going to give anything away because he has spent a long time practicing not giving things away. We've been reviewing the investigation into the network intrusion, Vivian said, and a related historical matter. The data module, Cross said, among other things. I circulated my findings to the board yesterday, he said. I assume that was what this meeting was about. It is, in part, Forsyth said. We've also reviewed Ms. Sterling's findings, and we have some questions. Of course. He opened his portfolio. I'm happy to address anything. Mr. Cross. Marsh cut across him cleanly, not loudly. We've gone through your report in detail. I want to focus on specific points. She turned to the display screen where Philip had already cued the first inconsistency. The credential log with Cross's access ID, time-stamped, unlogged, in the official security report. This is your executive credential ID, she said. This access event occurred 6 weeks ago. It does not appear in the standard security audit log for that date. Can you explain the discrepancy? Cross looked at the screen. His face was careful. Security maintenance accesses are sometimes processed through a secondary system, he said. It's a known protocol gap we've been meaning to address. I flagged it in Q2. You flagged the gap, Marsh said, not this specific access. The gap covers all such accesses. I pulled the Q2 maintenance records, Philip said from beside the display. The flagged gap relates to routine patch deployments between midnight and 4 a.m. This access occurred at 11:17 in the morning. A small silence. I'd need to review the specific instance, Cross said. There are 6 additional instances, Philip said, and put them on the screen one at a time, each with its timestamp, each in a time window outside the flagged maintenance gap. Cross looked at the 7 entries on the screen for a moment. He looked at Vivian. He looked at Riker, and the look he gave Riker was flat and measuring and lasted a fraction of a second too long. This is what I was concerned about, Cross said, and his voice was still even, controlled, the product of long practice. Mr. Hayes has been in this building for 3 days. He has access to personnel who can pull records, and he has a documented history of intelligence operations. The presence of flagged credential activity appearing now, after he arrived, is something I'd want any objective observer to consider carefully. Meaning you're suggesting Mr. Hayes planted the evidence, Marsh said. I'm suggesting the timing is notable, Cross said. These records are time-locked, Philip said. The archival system uses an independent timestamp server that is not accessible from within the building's primary network. They cannot be altered or inserted retroactively without leaving a forensic trace. and there is no such trace. Cross shifted slightly in his chair. Let's talk about your report, Riker said. Everyone at the table looked at him. He'd been quiet for several minutes, and the sound of his voice had a specific effect in the room. Not dramatic, not performed, just the weight of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had found it. Page 3, he said. You cite a credential access to a government contractor archive 3 weeks after the operation. My military credentials were under administrative suspension during that period. He looked at Cross directly. 7-week suspension, standard protocol for personnel exiting a deniable operation. I have the documentation. Cross was still. Suspensions of that type can be circumvented by personnel with the right operational knowledge. Yes, Riker said. They can. And if I'd circumvented mine, there would be a trace in the suspension record, a specific flag that gets automatically logged when suspension overrides occur. That flag doesn't exist in my record. He paused. Philip ran it this morning. Philip put the suspension record on the screen. Clean. No override flag. Page 6, Riker said. The grid coordinate for the alleged handoff. You place it at a building inside the security cordon. He let that sit for 1 second. Inside the cordon, the handoff you're describing would require me to be simultaneously inside and outside a controlled perimeter. That's not possible. Something moved in Cross's jaw. Barely visible. Operational grids are imprecise, Cross said. Coordinate drift over time. These were fixed-point coordinates tied to a permanent structure, Riker said. Not a field position, not a moving element. The building exists. It's inside the cordon. That coordinate doesn't drift. Marsh was writing notes. Forsyth was watching Cross. Page 9, Riker said. The 2314 timestamp. 2 unnamed witnesses place me at an alternate location. At 2314, I was at a specific point on the extraction route, which Ms. Sterling can corroborate. Cross turned to Vivian. For the first time since he'd sat down, something in his expression was not quite as controlled. Vivian, he said. You were barely conscious. You've said so yourself. Your memory of that night is fragmented. It is, Vivian said. I have specific memories, not a continuous record. She looked at him without looking away. I remember the stone wall. I remember being told to put my hand on it. I remember that Riker was 4 feet from me at that moment. Those aren't interpretations, Damien. They're sensory memories. The cold of the stone. His voice telling me we were almost there. Cross looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the room. He was calculating something. Riker could see it. The same kind of calculation he'd seen on his face that second day in the operations center, but larger now, and with fewer options feeding into it. He was a man who had built a 10-year architecture and was watching it come apart wall by wall, and the calculation was no longer about protecting the architecture, but about which pieces of the wreckage he could still use. I want legal counsel present, Cross said. You have the right to that, Forsyth said. We're not a court. This is an internal board session. Your counsel will need to be present for anything that follows this conversation, but nothing prevents you from saying what you'd like to say right now. Cross closed his portfolio. He said nothing for a long moment. I built this company, he said finally, and his voice had changed. The executive register was still there, but something under it had shifted, something that sounded almost like a man talking to himself. I came in when Vivian had 4 employees and a government contract that was 60 days from falling through. I restructured the operations. I brought in the defense partners. I negotiated the clearances that made this company viable. You did, Vivian said, quietly. You did all of that. And I watched the architecture I built get sold to people for a fraction of what it was worth, he said. Technology we developed, that I helped develop, that I knew had a market value 50 times what our contracts were paying, going to government buyers at fixed rate, because that was the ethical thing to do. He said the last 5 words with a precision that made them sound like something he'd been holding for a long time. Damien, Vivian said. I'm not asking for absolution, he said, which told Riker he understood exactly how far past that he was. I'm telling you how it happened, that's all. You leaked proprietary architecture to foreign buyers, Marsh said. It was not a question. I facilitated a transaction that the market would have reached eventually regardless, he said. The technology would have been reverse engineered within 5 years. What I did accelerated a timeline, not an outcome. The room absorbed this. And the data module, Forsyth said. Cross looked at the sealed evidence bag on the side table. Something in his expression was harder to read now. Not regret exactly, but the look of a man examining the distance between where he started and where he ended up and finding it longer than he'd anticipated. The module contained architecture I needed access to for the transaction, he said. When it disappeared that night, I assumed Hayes had taken it. It was the only explanation that made sense operationally. And when we found it, Vivian said, with the seal intact. I saw the forensic report Keene filed, Cross said. I knew then that my timeline was wrong. But you filed the counter-report anyway, Riker said. Cross looked at him. I'd been preparing that report for 3 years as a contingency. Once I knew you were in the building, you activated it. I needed time. Time for what? Marsh said. He didn't answer that. The room was quiet. Outside the window, Savannah continued its mourning. Riker could hear a delivery truck somewhere below, the distant sound of traffic on the perimeter road. Financial transfers, Marsh said. Philip, can you bring up the Cayman series? Philip advanced the display to a new page. What appeared on the screen was a financial ledger, 12 discrete transactions over the course of 6 years, routed through a series of holding entities to an account in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were not small. The largest single transaction was 8 figures. Cross looked at the screen and said nothing. These were identified by Philip's forensic audit team this morning, Marsh said. The routing structure is complex, but the source accounts connect to Sterling Defense Technologies technology licensing line. The transactions coincide with specific milestones in your alleged foreign technology transfers. I'll want to review those with counsel, Cross said. Of course, Forsyth said. Marsh set down her pen. Damien, in the interest of the record, the foreign buyers, were they hostile to American interests? A long pause. Define hostile, Cross said. I think you know what we mean, Forsyth said. Another pause. Longer. Some of them had overlapping interests, Cross said carefully. Not direct hostility. Commercial interests. The technology had civilian applications. Defensive electronic countermeasure architecture, Marsh said flatly. What civilian application did you have in mind? He didn't answer. Riker thought about what Vivian had said to him on the first day. If it fell into the wrong hands, could be reverse engineered into an offensive weapon. He thought about what kind of man spent 8 years building trust and smiled across a conference room table and asked about a sick mother and sent flowers to a hospital, and all the while was running a transaction in the background that he'd convinced himself was just accelerating an inevitable timeline. He thought about Marcus Webb and Daniel Ortega and about the ambush that had been waiting for them on a mission that was supposed to have been secure. He said it quietly and without accusation in his voice, because he didn't need to perform it. The ambush that night, he said. The mission was compromised before we went in. Marcus said someone talked. He looked at Cross. The mission file. Was that you? Cross was very still. Was that you? Riker said again. The room was so quiet that the sound of the delivery truck outside was audible. I passed operational parameters to a contact, Cross said very precisely, like each word was being weighed before release. I did not intend for an armed response. Marcus Webb had 2 daughters, Riker said. They're in their 20s now. He wasn't angry when he said it. That was the thing. He'd carried the weight of that night for long enough that it had become something flatter. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, just the bare fact of what had happened and what it had cost, stated plainly because plain was the only honest register for it. Cross looked at the table. This session is concluded, Forsyth said. He looked at Vivian. We have what we need. I'll be making a call within the hour to our legal team and to the relevant federal contacts. Damien, I'd advise you not to leave the building until we've completed that call. It will go better for you if you cooperate voluntarily with what comes next rather than waiting to be compelled. Cross looked at Forsyth for a moment. Then he nodded, once, small. He picked up his portfolio and stood up and walked to the door with the careful bearing of a man who understood that how he walked out of this room was one of the few things he still had control over. He closed the door behind him. The room held its collective breath for one beat, and then everyone started moving at once. Forsyth on his phone, Marsh talking quietly to Philip about the financial records, the two remaining board members conferring in low voices at the end of the table. The kind of controlled industry that follows a moment that has been building for a long time and finally breaks. Vivian was sitting very still at the head of the table. Riker stayed in his chair until the room thinned out, Philip taking his display equipment and the other board members filtering into the corridor in pairs. When it was just him and Vivian, he stayed where he was. She had her hands on the table and she was looking at the door Cross had closed, and her face was doing several things at once that she wasn't bothering to manage. "He was at my mother's hospital," she said. "I know." He knew the name of her doctor. He asked about her prognosis. She stopped. He brought those flowers and stood in the corridor and asked how she was sleeping. There was nothing useful to say to that, so Riker didn't say anything. "I don't know how someone does that," she said, not asking him, just naming it. "Some people get very good at the surface of things," he said, "and they mistake the surface for the interior." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't going to cry in the boardroom, and he suspected she wasn't going to cry about this at all. Not today. Not in front of anyone. Maybe not for a while. People built like her, who'd been carrying something this long, tended to process alone. "The ambush," she said. "Yeah. He's responsible for Marcus and Ortega. In part." He kept his voice even. "The people who pulled the triggers are responsible. He provided information that put them in position to make that choice. There are lawyers and federal agents who will spend considerable time sorting out the legal framing of that. But in the plain sense of it, yes, he's responsible." She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For starting this at your front door with a convoy of SUVs and an accusation." "You were looking for an answer." "I was looking for someone to blame," she said. "There's a difference." She opened her eyes. "The module was missing and 2 men were dead and you were the only thread, and it was easier to follow the thread than to sit with the possibility that the answer was somewhere I hadn't looked." She paused. "He was right next to me the entire time, for 8 years. "He was good at it," Riker said. "I told you that before." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true, and because the alternative is for you to spend the next 10 years carrying guilt that belongs to him. I've watched people do that. It doesn't serve anyone." She looked at him for a moment. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said. "The telling people what they need to hear instead of what they want to hear, without being unkind about it." "My daughter has strong opinions," he said. "You develop skills." Something in her face loosened, not quite a smile, but adjacent. Forsyth knocked on the open door. "Vivian, federal contacts are on the line. They're asking if we can do this by video or if they need to come to us." "Tell them video," she said, already straightening. "Give me 3 minutes." Forsyth nodded and disappeared. Vivian stood. She picked up her materials. She looked at Riker. "I need to take this call," she said. "Go," he said. "Will you?" She stopped. "I don't know what I'm asking." "I'll be here," he said. She nodded and went out. He sat alone in the conference room. Through the window, the September light was doing the same thing it did at the marina on good mornings. Low angle, golden, indifferent to everything that had just happened in this room and in the rooms before it. He thought about the Bertram with its repaired fuel system sitting in the slip at the marina. He thought about the note on the refrigerator and Ava eating banana bread before breakfast, which she absolutely had done. He got up and went to the window and stood there, and the building continued around him. And somewhere above him, Vivian Sterling was on a call with federal agents beginning to unravel a decade of careful, patient, technically sophisticated betrayal. He stayed until she was done. The federal agents arrived on a Thursday. 2 of them in the kind of unremarkable sedans that federal agents always seem to drive, as if there was a regulation somewhere specifying that nothing about their vehicles should invite a second look. They came to the building quietly. No announcement, no visible security theater, and Vivian met them in a 3rd-floor conference room with Philip Garrett and the company's outside legal counsel and a banker's box of documentation that Philip had spent 2 days assembling with the careful precision of a man who understood that the integrity of evidence was the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. Riker was not in that meeting. He was in the marina, replacing the fuel filter on a 26-foot Mako that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Gerald, who called it his retirement present to himself and took it out every Saturday without fail and talked to it the way some people talk to pets. Gerald was the kind of customer Riker appreciated, patient, honest about what had gone wrong, grateful for the repair without making a production of the gratitude. He was under the engine cover when his phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "They're here. Philip is walking them through the financial records first. Keen is presenting the forensic module certification at 2. I'll call tonight." He read it twice, put the phone back in his pocket, and went back to Gerald's fuel filter. There was something he'd been thinking about since the board meeting, something that had not resolved itself cleanly the way the factual inconsistencies in Damien's report had resolved. The facts had been navigable. You found the joint in the fabricated material, you documented the contradiction, you presented it to people with the authority to act on it. Facts had a shape you could work with. What he'd been thinking about was harder to hold. He thought about the moment Damien Cross had said, "I did not intend for an armed response," and the specific, careful precision of those words. Not "I didn't know," not "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," but that particular construction that left open every door while appearing to close them. He'd been doing that for 8 years, constructing sentences that had exits built into them. And the thing that sat in Riker's chest about it, the thing he kept turning over, was not anger exactly. Anger was too simple and too clean for what it actually was. Marcus Webb had 2 daughters who grew up without their father. Daniel Ortega had been 26 years old with a cracked chest plate that never got replaced because of a supply issue that nobody had flagged in time. Those were the facts of it, plain and irreducible, and no federal proceeding was going to change them. What the proceeding would do, what Vivian's documentation and Philip's audit records and Keen's forensic certification would do, was establish accountability. Not restoration, just accountability. Riker had been in enough situations to understand the difference between those two things, and to understand that the difference mattered even when restoration was impossible. He finished the fuel filter. Gerald came down to the dock at noon, and Riker showed him the blockage he'd removed, and Gerald said it looked like something from the inside of a very old drain, which was more or less accurate. And Riker gave him the bill, and Gerald paid it and said he'd see him next time something broke, which Gerald seemed to regard as an acceptable relationship model. He drove home and made lunch and thought about what came next. Damien Cross was formally arrested on a Friday morning, 11 days after the board meeting. Vivian called him while he was dropping Ava at school. He sat in the parking lot of the elementary school and watched the kids stream in through the main entrance while she told him Cross had been taken into federal custody at 6 a.m., and the charges included technology transfer violations, economic espionage, destruction of federal records, and what the federal prosecutor's office was describing as conspiracy in connection with a classified operation, the last of which was the charge that would be most difficult to prosecute, but that the government was determined to pursue. "There's a press statement going out this afternoon," Vivian said. "Company level. I'm not going to name you in it." "I appreciate that. The federal case will become public record at some point. Your name may surface in the periphery. I wanted you to know that before it happens." He watched a small boy drop his backpack near the entrance and chase it across the pavement, oblivious. "Okay," he said. "There will also be a formal company statement about the investigation. It will include an acknowledgement that an individual was wrongly accused in the initial inquiry and that the accusation was unfounded." She paused. "I wrote that section myself." "Vivian, I know you're going to tell me it isn't necessary." "It isn't necessary." "It is to me," she said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at the school entrance. The last few kids were filtering in, the late ones moving a little faster than they probably meant to. "Okay," he said. "How's Ava?" It was the first time she'd asked. He noticed it. "She's good," he said. "She went to the fair last weekend with her friend Jordan. She has strong opinions about the ring toss." A brief sound on the phone that was close to a laugh. "Tell her the ring toss is rigged," Vivian said. "She already knows. She just thinks it should be illegal. She's 7, and she understands regulatory oversight better than half my board." Don't tell her that. Her ego is already well developed. This time Vivian actually laughed, and the sound of it was different from anything he'd heard from her in the 5 days they'd spent together in that building. Lighter, less effortful, not produced for any particular purpose. "I'd like to take you to dinner," she said, "when things have settled, both of you, I mean, you and Ava, as I don't know what the right word is, a thank you that's not a professional thank you." He thought about what he'd said to her in the conference room, about the surface of things being mistaken for the interior. He thought about how easy it would be to deflect, to say it wasn't necessary, to fold the offer into the general category of settled business and let it go. "She'll want to pick the restaurant," he said. "Fair warning, what kind of places does she like? Anywhere that has good fries and doesn't make her feel like she has to sit too still." "I'll find something," she said. 3 weeks passed. The company's press statement ran on a Tuesday and generated the kind of industry coverage that Vivian's PR team had predicted. Significant, focused on the espionage angle, relatively contained in terms of damage to the company's standing, because the narrative was one of a CEO who had identified and addressed an internal conspiracy rather than one who had presided over it. The distinction mattered in the way that distinctions between those two things always mattered, and the company's share value, after a difficult 48 hours, recovered. Riker read about it online at the marina, between a prop replacement and a gel coat repair, on his phone in the 15 minutes he had between jobs. He found he had no strong feeling about the coverage either way. It was the world turning, events folding into the record, the official version assembling itself from the available facts in the way official versions always did, selecting some things, omitting others, finding a shape that was broadly true and specifically incomplete. What he thought about more in those weeks was the storage unit. He'd gone back once, a few days after the board meeting, and stood in front of the equipment case for a long time. The case was empty now, in a different way. The module was gone, in federal evidence, and the specific corner where it had sat for a decade had the quality of a space that has been occupied so long the vacancy itself has presence. He'd looked at the footlocker, the duffel bags, the cracked plastic tote. He'd taken the tote home. He'd gone through it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Ava was at May's, the way you go through something you've been avoiding. Not ceremonially, not with any particular emotional preparation, just opening it and working through it the same way you'd work through a junk drawer that had gotten out of hand. Old documents, administrative paperwork, a commendation letter he'd never framed and never would. A photograph he'd forgotten was in there. His team, the one before the last team, 12 people on the deck of a ship somewhere in blue water, squinting into the sun. Marcus was on the left side of the photo, grinning. Riker sat with that for a while. Not long, just a while. Then he put the photo in the drawer of his bedside table, because that felt like the right place for it. Not displayed, not destroyed, just present and accessible and close enough. He didn't go back to the storage unit after that. He called the rental office and told them he'd be clearing it out by end of month. And he did. Church. The dinner was on a Wednesday evening in October, when the coastal air had finally made the full turn into fall, and the light was doing things it only did in October on the Georgia coast, amber and low and carrying the particular quality of the year winding down without quite ending. Vivian had found a place on the waterfront in Savannah, not expensive in a way that announced itself, but good. The kind of place where the fries were actually good, and the tables were spaced far enough apart that a 7-year-old with a confident personality and a loud laugh wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. Ava had dressed herself, which was always an experience. She'd chosen the blue anchor shirt, laundered, at least, and paired with what she considered her best jeans, and had done her hair into something she was calling a braid, which was technically only a braid at the top, and then gave up about halfway down into something more improvisational, and she'd looked at herself in the bathroom mirror with the expression of someone who was satisfied with their choices and wasn't particularly interested in outside input. In the car, she was quiet for a few minutes, which was unusual enough that Riker glanced at her. "You okay?" "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether she's going to be like a professional dinner person, and whether I'm going to have to sit a certain way." He understood this. Ava had attended enough of his rare professional obligations to have developed a specific anxiety about what she called professional dinner people, a category defined by excessive posture and a habit of asking questions she couldn't answer about school. She's not like that, he said. How do you know? Because she asked me to find a place with good fries. Ava considered this seriously. That's a good sign, she concluded. Vivian was already there when they arrived, at a corner table that she'd clearly chosen for the same reasons Riker would have chosen it, back to the wall, sightlines to the entrance, positioned so that the louder section of the restaurant was to one side rather than directly adjacent. He noticed that without meaning to. Some things you just carried. She'd dressed down from the boardroom version of herself. Dark jeans, a simple shirt, her hair loose in a way he hadn't seen it before. She stood when they came to the table, not with the formality of a business greeting, but with something more tentative, which he found more honest. She looked at Ava. Ava looked at her with the full 3-second assessment. I like your jacket, Ava said. It was a green jacket, hung on the back of her chair. Thank you, Vivian said. I like your braid. I did it myself, Ava said, with the candor of someone who felt this fact was relevant. I can tell, Vivian said. It has personality. Ava seemed to find this satisfactory. She sat down and picked up the menu and began evaluating it with the focus she brought to things she considered important. Riker sat across from Vivian, and for a moment they looked at each other across the table, and neither of them said anything, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been through something together and were still finding the shape of what they were to each other on the other side of it. Thank you for coming, she said. You've got to stop thanking me for things, he said. Old habit. Work on it. She smiled. Not the boardroom version, not the controlled executive register, just a person smiling across a restaurant table. The fries were good. Ava confirmed this 3 bites in and reported her assessment to the table with the gravity of a professional verdict. Vivian asked about the fare, and Ava gave a detailed account of the ring toss that covered both the likely mechanism of its being rigged and the question of its legal status, which Vivian engaged with seriously and without condescension. She asked follow-up questions. She proposed a theory about the physics of the rings that Ava immediately began testing against her own observations. And within 10 minutes, Ava had shifted from cautious assessment to full conversational investment, which was the highest endorsement she had to offer. Riker sat back and watched this happen. He thought about something a friend had told him years ago, before the Navy, before any of it, that the real test of a person wasn't how they treated people they needed something from, but how they treated people they didn't. It was a simple observation and not particularly original, and he'd half forgotten it over the years, but he thought about it watching Vivian Sterling lean slightly forward over the table and engage with complete sincerity in a 7-year-old's regulatory theory about carnival games. There was no professional angle in it, no networking, no performance for his benefit. She was just a person talking to a kid about something the kid cared about, and she was doing it like it mattered. He found himself thinking, she's not what I thought she was, either. Not just the version who'd showed up at his door with a convoy and an accusation, that version he'd already adjusted away from. Something broader. He'd spent 5 days in that building watching her hold a structure together under pressure that would have fractured most people. Watching her absorb the knowledge that someone she'd trusted for 8 years had been running a parallel life inside her company. Watching her sit in a conference room and corroborate a man she'd wrongly accused with the same precision she brought to everything, because it was the right thing to do, and that apparently mattered to her even when it cost her something. She was not easy. She was exacting and impatient in ways she didn't always notice, and she had the specific blind spots that came from building something large at a young age. The tendency to trust process over instinct, the difficulty with information that didn't fit a framework she'd already constructed. She'd carried a wrong answer for 10 years because the right answer was too close to look at, but she was trying to be honest about that. That counted for something. It counted for more than something, actually. In his experience, the willingness to sit with having been wrong, not to perform contrition, but to genuinely revise, was rarer than most people wanted to admit. After dinner, while Ava was in the bathroom, Vivian set down her coffee cup and looked at him. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know that your answer, whatever it is, doesn't affect anything professionally and doesn't affect this. She gestured at the table, the evening, the general territory. This is already settled, regardless of what you say. He waited. I'm restructuring the company's security operations, she said. Post Damien, the entire framework needs to be rebuilt. I've been meeting with external consultants and I'm not satisfied. They bring the right credentials and the wrong instincts. She paused. What you did in that building, the network analysis, the intrusion response, reading Damien before the rest of us had any concrete evidence, that wasn't consulting. That was a different kind of knowing. I'm not a corporate security architect, he said. I know. I'm not asking for that. She looked at him directly. I want to offer you a formal role, Chief Security Strategist. You'd report directly to me. The scope would involve overall threat assessment and building a framework for how we evaluate and respond to security vulnerabilities. Not day-to-day management, not a full-time office presence. I'd want you 4 to 6 days a month, more during active situations, less during stable periods. He looked at her. I fix boats, he said. I know. I drop Ava at school on Tuesdays and Thursdays because those are the days she and I have established as the days I drop her, and that structure matters to her. I know that too. The title, you don't have to use the title, she said. Frankly, I don't care what we put on the paperwork. I care about what you actually do. She picked up her coffee cup. I'm not asking you to change your life. I'm asking if there's a version of this that fits inside your life. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the Bertram, about Gerald and his retirement boat, about the Pelican on the piling on good September mornings. He thought about the fact that he'd spent 3 days in that building and found, to his own mild surprise, that some part of his mind had come alive in a way it hadn't been in 4 years. Not with urgency or adrenaline, nothing like the old operational register, but with the specific engagement of a problem worth solving. The satisfaction of it had been real. He thought about Marcus's daughters and Ortega's cracked plate, and about the fact that the technology Damien had sold was in the world now and had always been going to be in the world, and about whether there was something to the idea of being in a room where that kind of thing could be addressed rather than in a storage unit where the consequences of it sat in an equipment case for a decade unexamined. He thought about Ava. 4 to 6 days a month, he said. Average. More sometimes, less others. If there's an active situation and I need to be home for Ava, then you're home for Ava, she said. That's not negotiable on my end either. He looked at her. Why not? She set down her coffee cup. Because a man who would compromise his daughter's schedule for a paycheck isn't someone I want making security judgments for my company. Those judgments require a specific kind of integrity, and that integrity has to run all the way through. He didn't say anything to that. He just sat with it. Ava came back from the bathroom and climbed back into her seat and picked up the last of her fries and looked between the two of them with the particular observational instinct she had. What are you talking about? She said. Work, Riker said. She looked at Vivian. Are you going to hire my dad? I'm asking if he wants to be hired, Vivian said. Ava chewed a fry thoughtfully. He's good at figuring things out, she said, in the tone of someone offering an objective assessment. And he's good at knowing when people are lying. He always knows when I'm lying. I believe that, Vivian said. He's not very good at grocery shopping, though, Ava added. We ran out of orange juice twice. That's noted, Vivian said, and looked at Riker with an expression he was beginning to recognize as the one that lived just before she actually laughed. He thought about the 9 inconsistencies on the legal pad. He thought about standing in the operations center with the alert tone slowing to silence and Mara saying you were right about the routing pattern. He thought about Vivian in this restaurant, leaning forward to talk to his daughter about carnival games like it was the most important conversation happening anywhere. Yeah, he said. Okay. Vivian looked at him. But I keep the shop, he said. I keep Gerald and his retirement boat and the Pelicans and the mornings. Obviously, she said, and orange juice is not part of the job description. I wasn't going to ask. Okay, he said. Then okay. Bolts. The months that followed were not a clean line. They were, like most things in the lives of imperfect people trying to build something real out of complicated materials, a series of adjustments and recalibrations and occasional missteps that had to be acknowledged and worked through rather than ignored. There were days Riker drove to Savannah and sat in meetings with people who used language he found unnecessary and frameworks he found overly complicated, And he said so, and sometimes they listened and sometimes they didn't, and he was not always right. He missed school pickups twice because of active situations, and each time he called May and called Ava and felt the particular guilt of a parent who has made a promise to be present and been pulled away. And he sat with that guilt rather than arguing it away because it was appropriate to feel it and important not to let it become an excuse. There were days Vivian came to the marina because their working relationship had evolved into something that happened in ordinary places as often as in professional ones, and she sat on the overturned crate he used as a table with a coffee from the shop on Harbor Street and reviewed whatever needed reviewing while he worked on whatever was under his hands. She was not comfortable being idle. He'd identified that in the first week. And she didn't know what to do with her hands when she wasn't doing something purposeful, and he found this quality both familiar and humanizing in a way he hadn't expected. She was also, it emerged gradually, someone who had been alone for a long time in a way she'd managed so successfully she'd mostly stopped noticing it. He recognized that too. It was Ava who named it first, with the direct strike accuracy of a child who had not yet learned to be tactful about things she'd observed. They were at the kitchen table on a Sunday in December, and Vivian was there. She'd been there for dinner the previous 3 Sundays, which had become something that nobody had formally decided and nobody was formally analyzing. And Ava looked up from her homework and said to no one in particular, "Vivian, are you going to be here for Christmas?" The table was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," Vivian said carefully. "That depends on what your dad and I figure out." Ava looked at Riker. "I think she should be here for Christmas." "That's a decision for grown-ups," Riker said. "You always say that when you don't want to say yes, but you're going to say yes anyway," Ava said, with the calmness of someone who had identified this pattern long ago. Riker looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Riker. She had a particular expression he'd come to know, the one where she was trying not to smile and the trying was losing. He'd also come to know that she was underneath the boardroom precision and the carefully constructed competence. Someone who laughed at things that were genuinely funny and got quietly sad about things that were genuinely sad and didn't always have a good way to show either and was working on it. He thought about the note on the refrigerator that first morning, the apologetic sorry about the orange juice, the pelican on the piling that wanted nothing from anyone. He thought about Marcus's photograph in the bedside drawer, that grin in the blue water light. He thought about Ortega, 26 years old, and about all the things that don't get restored, only carried. He'd been carrying his portion of that weight for a long time, and he understood now that the weight didn't go away. You just got better at distributing it, at building a life around it that was strong enough to hold it without collapsing. That was what healing actually was, in his experience, not the absence of the weight, but the presence of something strong enough to carry it alongside you. "I'll be here for Christmas," Vivian said. She said it to Ava first, which was the right order. Then she looked at Riker. He nodded. Ava went back to her homework with the satisfied air of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. In March, Damian Cross entered a guilty plea to 4 of the 7 federal charges against him. The proceeding was reported in the industry press and in one national publication, and then the news cycle moved on the way news cycles do, finding fresher material elsewhere, and the case joined the long record of things that had happened and been documented and been partially understood, and would continue to be sorted through by people whose job it was to sort. Riker read about the plea on his phone at the marina in the same 15-minute window between jobs, leaning against the same dock post he'd been leaning against when he'd read about the press statement months earlier. The Pelican was on its piling. Gerald's Mako was in the slip, recently back from a weekend trip, salt-streaked and needing a wash. He thought about Marcus Webb's daughters. He hoped, in the simple and private way that you hope for people you'll never meet, that the plea meant something to them. That the accountability, incomplete as it was, landed somewhere useful. He didn't know. He would probably never know. That was its own thing to carry, and he'd made a place for it. He put his phone away and went to work on Gerald's boat. The water moved against the pilings the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, and oddly reassuring in its indifference. Here before all of it, here after, unmoved by the particular complications of the humans on its surface. He thought about what Vivian had said to him once, Late in the evening at the marina while Ava was at Maze and the sun was going down across the water in a way that made everything look briefly like it had been arranged. I spent 10 years looking for the answer in the wrong place, and the answer was just in a box. In a room, 30 feet from your front door. He'd said, "That's usually how it goes. The thing you're looking for turns out to be somewhere you didn't think to check because you'd already decided it couldn't be there." She'd looked at him for a moment. "Is that about the module or something else?" "Both, maybe," he'd said. "Most things." He hadn't been trying to be wise about it. He'd just been being accurate, in the plain way he tried to be accurate about most things. But accuracy, sometimes, was its own kind of wisdom. The willingness to say what was actually there, instead of what you'd decided should be there. And to revise when the thing in front of you didn't match the version in your head. He'd been doing that revision for a while now. So had she. Neither of them had gotten it perfectly right, because nobody did. But they were both still looking at what was actually there and adjusting, and that was most of it. That was most of what it took. The Pelican lifted off the piling without any visible reason and banked out across the water toward the open horizon, and the morning light caught the underside of its wings for one moment before it turned and was just a shape against the sky. And then it was gone. Riker picked up his tools and got back to work.